Last chapter we talked about revolutions, and now we're going to have even more revolutions. Guess where? France, of course. And we're going to talk about why the revolutions happened and the efforts made to consolidate and build the nations. Well, we will if I can get the thing to turn. Okay, let's try that. In 1848, Mitterrand and King Louis Philippe had fled to England. Marx and Engels had published the Communist Manifesto, which stirred up a lot of people. And it could be considered the last wave of the liberal revolutions that had begun back in 1789 with the beginning of the French Revolution. But nationalism and liberalism, we're going to have a new meaning of the word nation. It's going to mean a sovereign people. The government's only going to be considered legitimate if it reflects that new meaning. And prior to this time, liberalism and nationalism were pretty closely associated, but the focus was on constitutions, rules of law, and representative assemblies. Nationalism, thus, was used against the monarchy. The revolutions of 1848 marked the end of the period of the liberal revolutions that were connected to nationalism. After 1848, the conservative governments, and there were several of them, they began to use nationalism to try to get popular support, get the people, the common people behind them. But only socialism was going against the tide of nationalism, and even there, nationalism was going to impact how socialism was viewed across Europe. The nation building continued into the late 19th century, of course, and American territorial changes and the American Civil War was reflected and thought about and talked about. Of course, there was a unification of Germany and Italy, and the Russians actually abolished serfdom, as well as America abolishing slavery. So the shifting balance of powers began to show, and the geopolitical power shift was toward the more centralized states. The waning power of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the Ottoman Empire has been going downhill for some decades now. But why did we have the revolution? Well, the social antagonisms, money problems, political changes, and nationalism, especially in southern, central, and eastern Europe, and it's going to grow throughout the 19th century and end up causing a war. The goals, well, the liberal goals were representation, electoral representation, an end of the privilege of the upper class, and for the government to do something to stimulate the economy and to have national unity. But the deteriorating economic climate helps explain some of the revolutions, because you have bad climate, you have bad harvest. Harvest failed completely in Europe in 1845 and 46. And the blight of the potato crop was so bad in Ireland that they were starving by the thousands. There was also hunger in Germany. So food prices doubled because of supply and demand. There wasn't many there, so the prices go straight up. And there were bread riots across Europe again, and people began seizing grain that had been stored. Cynical industrial slowdown compounded the problems, of course, because one of the first things a business does is start laying people off and trying to cut back. And the public relief organizations were actually overwhelmed with people demanding help. And there were other crises. Any response that the government made, it seemed all it needed to do was look like they were totally unfeeling and not knowing what the heck was going on. So there was no public relief across France. There were troops repressing riots, the potato riots especially in Berlin. And all of a sudden, the upper class, the regime, began to arm the middle class against the poor. The liberals sought constitutional government. Republicans campaigned for universal man suffrage. The nationalists challenged the legitimacy of the hereditary rulers. And the socialists appealed to the economically vulnerable. I haven't got anything, and the government's not promised me anything, so this other organization looks pretty interesting. And guess what? The monarchy of King Louis Philippe appealed. It looked like it was no different than the previous monarchs of Louis XVIII and Charles X. And although Louis Philippe worked closely with the banking and industrial elite, he seemed to neglect the poor. And he ignored demands to expand the voting rights. And of course, graft and corruption was nothing new, but were rampant. So there was protest movements. Rebellions in Paris and Lyon, and of course the government used the military to harshly suppress them. The government seemed to refuse to compromise in any way, and all it's doing is driving the moderates into the opposition camps. So to get around the laws prohibiting assemblies, they would have big banquets, which I thought was quite amusing. Liberals, Republicans, and for the first time, socialists. New constitution with universal manhood suffrage, and we're going to abolish slavery. Again, I thought we already did that. Tensions between the Republicans and the socialists were still there, and any hope of a coalition was just totally shattered. Of course, the provisional governments responded with national workshops and programs of public works and jobs for the unemployed. Of course, they were headed by a socialist called Louis Blanc. But it was insufficient. There was just not enough jobs to go around. And of course, the people who lived on farms out away from the cities, they resented all this increase in taxes to pay for the city services. Provisional governments lifted restrictions on speech and assembly. So we no longer have to have banquets. Now we can just assemble. And there were hundreds of new journals printed and newspapers appeared. Women's clubs and newspapers began demanding universal suffrage, not just universal manhood suffrage. But the middle class is getting a little bit scared. And they're the ones who elect the moderates and the monarchists. So the new assembly that was elected decided to oppose these workshops. So they closed them to anybody new coming into the country. And they forced many to join the army since they didn't have a job. And finally, very shortly thereafter, the workshops were totally ended. So the workers of Paris revolted again, taking to the streets in June 23rd to 26th. Over 3,000 were killed by the military because it was very brutally suppressed. So any support the government had before is going to go down the tubes. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was elected twice. And of course, this is not the same one. He had twice as many votes as the other three candidates combined, and it was the name that drew the vote. But he did appeal to conservatives and some on the left. He was going to rally Catholics by restoring the role of the Catholic Church in education. And he's going to ban radical activities and suspend the press freedoms for a while, with the excuse it's just for a while. Of course, there would be conflict with the National Assembly over the next 3 years of his rule or reign, or however you want to describe it. In 1851, frustrated by the limits to his power, Louis Napoleon calls for new elections. And the plebiscite gave him authority to change the Constitution, so he established a second empire by referendum and declared himself Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. It sounds like you're hearing the same thing over and over again, doesn't it? He is assessing the French Revolution. Well, the dynamics of the revolution appeared everywhere in France. The initial success were followed by division among the troops, followed by return of authoritarian control. The United States was the only one that ever had a successful revolution that didn't resort to dictators and authoritarian rule immediately afterwards. The tension between the moderates and the radicals led to the collapse of the Republic. Oh, surprise, right? The moderates disliked the chaos and disorder brought on by these people who were wishing for a more radical reform. And there was a polarization right straight down across class lines. And you know what that's going to do. But the similarities between the German Revolution and the revolutions in France were both wanted constitutional government and greater press freedoms. Well, this is a reasonable desire. Both wanted representative government, although in Germany they didn't necessarily want universal male suffrage. But the workers in the cities gravitated to more radical ideologies. They wanted a little bit of things different than they did out in the countryside. But the differences were the German peasants were burdened with feudal obligations still. France was already a centralized state, so no Germany existed as Germany per se in 1848. There was still a bunch of little principalities. So only centralizing along Germanic peoples was the loose confederation of the 39 states, including Austria and Prussia. It's called the German Confederation. And it was intended to provide defense, but there was no executive power. And Prussia and Austria were in competition completely who's going to be the boss. And of course, this is going to complicate the task of anybody trying to revolutionize anything. Prussia tried to establish itself as the leading Germanic state in years after 1815, and it didn't work. Sovereign, with the customs union, it was established free trade among the Germanic states and union tariff against the rest of the world. And by the 1840s, it included almost all the Germanic states except Austria. Well, political clubs began building in Prussia and the smaller states. and students and other radicals joined with the middle-class reform groups. New demands for representative government began to dominate Prussia. They were attacks on the autocracy and the bureaucratic authority. There again, we still don't like these authoritarian rulers. Frederick William IV. Well, he made gestures toward the liberal reforms in the early part of his reign, but his regime began to report to the authoritarianism that was present during the Hungry 40s, during all those bread riots and potato riots because of bad crops. He crushed the revolt of Sicilian weavers, and he openly opposed constitutionalism. He wasn't going to give up any of his powers. Protest in 1848 emerges again from France, and the Bavarian King Ludwig I grants freedom to the press to halt his student protests. And other German states begin to promise elections, expanded suffrage, and liberal reforms. We'll promise anything to get you to be quiet and go home. And Frederick William was shaken by the unrest, and the king promised a constitution. But promises and actions don't sometimes mix. The Frankfurt Assembly and German nationhood. Well, most of the 800 delegates represented the professionals, classes of lawyers and professional. They called it the Professors' Parliament. And most were liberals, moderate liberals. They desired a constitution for a liberal, unified Germany. But there was no current unified Germany for them to reform. So their assumptions were kind of out in left field. The assembly, there was no sovereign power to take, no single legal code, no army. I mean, it was a confederation of loosely affiliated states, and that was about it. But the major issues before the assembly were the nationalist question. Are we going to be a great German or a smaller Germany? Now, Prussia and Austria are still in competition. Are we going to have a hereditary monarch? Are we going to have an elected monarch? Are we going to have a republic? Now, the federal independent states, or are we going to have unified central government? The federal independent states would be similar to the American form of government with the United States, but with a unified federal central government. But, of course, the nationalistic question was the one that was causing the most concern. There was the Great German versus the Small Germany. And the Assembly began to accept the Small Germany solution, leaving out all the lands of the Habsburgs, including Germany, Austria. In April of 1849, they offered the crown to Frederick William IV of a unified Germany. German Confederation in 1815. As you can see, there are a whole bunch of little states in there. Everybody's got their own ruler, and then no ruler wants to give up his power. So Frederick William IV began negotiating from what he thought was a position of strength. And while the delegates at the assembly debated, the king began to try to put down the radicals. He was encouraged by the backlash against the revolutions in Europe. So, assembly desires Republican-style government. Yes, it does. It needed Prussia, and they demanded a monarch, the Kaiser. So they compromised with constitutional monarchy, and Frederick William refused the assembly's offer as being demeaning. So he dissolves the assembly. So the delegates all left not very happy, convinced that the liberals and the nationalist goals were incompatible. And a lot of the people fled to the United States, and others just simply abandoned liberalism altogether. Peasants ransacked tax offices and burned the castles because they figured if any of the papers were destroyed, you couldn't collect taxes on something you didn't know was there. Workers began to smash machines in factories. And there were formation of citizens' militias. And, of course, the newspapers and political clubs grew like rabbits. The rulers took advantage of the middle-class sphere to undo the liberal reforms. So the liberal reformers now saw national unification as a way of maintaining order. Ethnicities and language groups, yes, there was a bunch, because you've got all these different little principalities, and sometimes they spoke different languages and had different religions. You got Germans and Czechs and Magyars and Poles and Slovaks and Serbs and Italians and others. So popular sovereignty by ethnicity implied a breakup of the Habsburg lands. And, of course, the national sentiment was strongest against Polish aristocrats. So the Habsburg began to play the Poles serfs against the Polish lords. Hungarian nationalists claimed advances by the small Magyar aristocracy, and I don't know if I can say his name or not, Lehos Kosov, Pan-Slavism. Now we're talking about the Russians. The Russians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Slovenists, the Croats, the Croats, the Macedonians, the Bulgarians. They all had a desire for the Slavic-speaking people, and they all spoke a form of the Slavic language. But the pro-Western Slavs resented Russian ambitions. Springtime of Peoples and Autumn of Empires. A lovely little title, and it brings images to mind of flowers and turning leaves. Kosovac stepped up his campaign against the Meterich system. He demanded representation institution. He wanted autonomy for the Hungarian Magyar nation. Vienna was popular, very popular. Students there were they were mostly students and artisans and musicians. Vienna reminds me a great deal of Greenwich Village in New York back in the day. But they're demanding political and social reforms. They built barricades and sacked the imperial palaces. And there was a central committee of citizens formed. So Meterich fled to Britain, and the government made a few concessions. The Italian liberals and nationalists attacked the empire's territories in Naples and Venice, as calls for Italian nationalism began to emerge in the South. So, I mean, it's going all over. I mean, you've got the Germanic states, you've got France, you've got the Slavic states. I mean, it's just like Russia and all of Europe is just in a turmoil. But there is a paradox of nationalism, because no cultural or ethnic majority could declare its independence without promoting rebellion from the other minorities in the same areas. So nationalism began to fracture the alliance between the Czechs and the German Bohemians. So the students and the workers led an insurrection in Prague, and Austrian troops were sent in to restore order, and the Slav Congress was forced to disband. The March laws passed by the Hungarian parliament abolished serfdom and noble privilege. Well, that sounded like a step in the right direction. That should have made people happy. It established freedom of the press and of religion. Whoa! They changed the suffrage requirements and enfranchised the small property holders. But this provoked opposition from the Czechs, the Serbs, and the Romanians within Hungary, because, like I say, you don't have one ethnic group. Austria and Hungary in 1848, springtime of peoples in the autumn. Kosovo severed all ties between Hungary and Austria. The irony is they're going to be unified very shortly. The new Emperor Franz Joseph asked Nicholas I of Russia for military support, so the Hungarian revolt was crushed by the Russian army. So the liberal government of Vienna capitulated in October of 49, and it reestablished censorship of the papers, disbanded the National Guard and the student organizations, and 25 of the revolutionary leaders went before the infamous firing squad. And Kosovo went into hiding in exile. So the paradox of nationalism? The Habsburg Empire was saved by the very nationalism which nearly tore it apart. And Franz Joseph gained support from the middle class, who took pride in ethnic toleration and some more, reforms and things for the middle class. Okay, the earlier stages of the Italian unification. There again, it was the same thing. You had a bunch of city-states with individual rulers. Patchwork of small states just like Germany. Lombard and Venetia controlled by Austria, not Australia. Tuscany, Parma, and Modena were ruled by the Habsburg descendants. Piedmont, Sardinia, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So you've got all these different ruling areas. Giuseppe Mazzini was a leading Italian nationalist. He's a former member of the Carbonari. He founded the Young Italy Society, and his mission was to bring republicanism to the world of Italy. He invaded Sardinia, and Mazzini was driven into exile. We tried, but it didn't work. Many shared Mazzini's commitment, but not his methods. But everybody hoped for a merger of existing governments into a constitutional monarchy. And back in 48, the hopes were raised for political and social change and Italian unification. March of that year, the popular revolts erupted in Venetia, Lombardy, and Milan. and Charles Albert of Piedmont, Sardinia, provided military support to the rebellion. He took up the banner of Italian nationalism. In February, the government of Rome declared a republic. Bazzani joined the revolutionary movement in Rome, and the French army invaded to protect the Pope, ending any dreams of a republic. The Austrian army gained the upper hand in the northern Italian states, and the Venetian Republic falls to the Austrians in August. So the revolutions, even though there was all over the country, they failed. But there was a hope left in the people of an Italian resurgence and unification. Conservatives had previously associated nationalism with liberalism. Now the states and the governments take the initiative. They're really concerned over this revolutionary stuff that's going on, and the states are promoting reforms. France under Napoleon III, well, he believed in personal rule in a centralized state. He wanted to control the finances, the army, and all foreign affairs. But he did want an elected assembly, but he didn't want them to have any power. And he undermined the traditional elites by expanding the bureaucracy. So the economic changes, well, faith in the ability of the industrial expansion to bring prosperity and national glory was just kind of in the middle grounds. There was new limited liability laws passed to supposedly help the businesses. And the government reluctantly permitted trade unions and legalization of strikes. Reluctantly. Well, Napoleon III's medieval infrastructure began to buckle under its own weight. You know, if it's got too much at the top, you're going to be top-heavy. And then there were cholera epidemics which killed tens of thousands, especially in the cities. By 1850, in Paris, only 1 in 5 houses actually had running water, which meant no sewage either. The political fears of crime and revolutionary activity in the poor neighborhoods was rampant. I mean, everybody, well, when you haven't got nothing, you've got nothing to lose. The medieval center of the city was raised for rebuilding and massive rebuilding of the medieval infrastructure. 34,000 new buildings were built. New water lines, new sewer lines, and new wide boulevards were built. But this raises the rents and drives the poor into what we call segregated suburbs or ghettos. So what's going on across the channel? Victorian Britain and the second reform bill. We had that really reform bill, remember, where it gave more people in the countryside to vote? The government's beginning to face demands to extend voting rights beyond the middle class. Because the industrial class is growing, and it's full of highly skilled laborers. They may not be property owners, but they're highly skilled and paid well. And there's buildings, and there's engineering, and there's textile industries growing on. So we've kind of turned away from the tradition of militant radicalism. English people just don't seem to get too upset too quickly. They favored collective self-help through cooperative societies and trade unions. And they all saw education as a way for being advanced. And it begins to create real pressure for electoral reform. Spread the franchise. And workers borrowed from the earlier middle-class campaigns. And dissenters from the Church of England, well, they'd been denied posts in the civil service and the military because of their non-religious affiliation. They could not attend Oxford or Cambridge, but they resented having to pay taxes to the Church of England. If I'm not going there and I don't support it, why have I got to pay for it? And they were across lines. There was no one ethnic group. It was all across lines. And this was very vital to the Liberal Party politics. So they began to see a campaign for a new reform bill, with working class leaders joining in with the middle class dissenters. And backed by conservative Benjamin Disraeli, the political life would be improved by including the aristocrats of labor. And he believed the newly enfranchised would vote conservative. So we're going to have another great reform bill. It's going to double the franchise. Men who paid poor rates of rent of £10 per year in the urban areas, rural tenants paying rent of £12 or more were going to be allowed to vote. Large northern cities gained representation, of course, and the lingering success of the Chartist movement began to be seen in this whole movement. So the reform bill was silent on women. So the women organized a movement, a suffrage movement. It would take militant suffrage in the First World War to bring women the vote, but decade following the 1867 Reform Bill was the high point of British liberalism. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Italian unification. Cavour and Garibaldi. Two visions of the Italian statehood, the Republic or the constitutional monarchy. Giuseppe Garibaldi joined the team of Mazzani for Republic, a constitutional monarchy as favored by the modern nationalists, where we'd have economic and political reforms, but no democracy. They pinned their hopes on Charles Albert, the King of Piedmont, Sardinia. Well, enter Count Camillo Benso de Cavour. He's prime minister to Victor Emmanuel II of Piedmont, Sardinia, and he pursued, I guess you'd say, pragmatic reforms guided by the state. Now, pragmatic simply means you're not held in trust by the way we've always done it. If we can find a better way to make it work, we'll try. He promoted economic expansion and a modern transportation infrastructure. And he kind of raised Piedmont, Sardinia's international profile. Cavour cultivated an alliance with France in order to drive the Austrians from Italy. Good idea. And there was even a war with Austria. Piedmont, Sardinia was annexed. They annexed Lombardy, but failed to drive the Austrians from Venetia. They were joined by Tuscany, Parma, and Modena. In the southern states, Francis II faced a peasant revolt in the Two Sicilies, and Garibaldi landed in Sicily in 1860. And they began to gain widespread support for unification. Garibaldi took Sicily and toppled the kingdom of Francis II, and then he marched on Rome. Cavour worried that Garibaldi would bring French or Austrian into the country to support him, and he preferred that unification take place quickly without domestic turmoil, so the king ordered Garibaldi to cede military authority. His dreams of a unified Italy were more important in his mind than to achieve a republic, so Victor Emmanuel II becomes king of Italy in 1861. Venetia remained in Austria's hands until 1966, when Austria was defeated by Prussia. I'm sorry, Austria wasn't defeated by Prussia. Prussia defeated Austria. I still didn't say it right, did I? Austria won that little conflict. Rome remains protected by the French troops until 1870, when France is defeated by Prussia. Rome becomes the capital of a united Italian kingdom in July, and the laws of the papal guarantees defined and limited the Pope's status. So Italian unification was regional and it had a lot of tensions. Italy has been made, but now we must make Italians, because only a majority of the Italians ever spoke Italian. Because of being overrun by other countries, they spoke French and Austrian and all these other different languages. There was a widening gap between the industrial north and the rural south that had always been around and is still around today. The tension between the landlords and the agricultural workers, of course. And, of course, the lingering resentment of the northern-oriented states against the South. So the reunification of Germany was called Realpolitik. Realpolitik. Practical, realistic politics. Rousseau, it is power alone that can rule. And power is more important than morality or ideology. He was closely associated with Otto von Bismarck, the minister-president of Prussia, starting in 1862. Frederick William IV of Prussia granted a Russian constitution with a bicameral parliament, a modified electoral system to reinforce hierarchies of wealth and power. In other words, you're not giving the poor people a voice. But there was a growth of the Prussian middle class, and they began to be very, shall we say, involved, because the intelligence is what they call, because they're very educated. And William I, which was a new king, he wanted to expand the standing army and take military matters out of parliamentary control and back into his own hands. But the opponents of this saw the king as trying to create his own personal army. So William I named Bismarck minister-president of Prussia. And here we go. Bismarck, the Iron Man, is going to take control big time. He was a Prussian junker, and he was a defender of the monarchy. He opposed liberalism and nationalism. Above all, he was a Prussian, through and through. He believed union was inevitable and that the Prussians ought to take the initiative. So he defied parliamentary opposition and started leading big time. He played the national card to preempt his liberal opponents, and he believed that the German Confederation was no longer useful. He also began to exploit the Austrian disadvantages. There was a dispute over the Schleswig-Holstein area, and the Danish king attempted to annex the disputed territory. But Bismarck persuaded Austria to join Prussia against Denmark, and he used tension between Prussia and the Austrian army and officials to provoke a war. He was the world's greatest at carrying misinformation to different people. He'd get his enemies to fight amongst themselves, and when they got good and weak, he'd walk in. Austria mobilizes for war first, along with most of the smaller Germanic states, and there was a 7 weeks war. And then at the end, Bismarck created the North German Confederation. But the Prussian victories weakened the liberal opposition, which he liked. Austria-Hungary compared to Germany after the 1860s. Germany is a strong, unified nation now. The Austro-Germanic peoples now ousted from a unified Germany. The Austria-Hungary Empire is weakened, multi-ethnic dual monarchy. The Hungarians were essentially reconquered, and the administration reforms consisted of a new and more uniform tax system and a rationalized taxation, I guess you'd call it. They opposed a single language policy favoring the German. So the subject nationalities protested the powerlessness of the local diets, the military repression, and cultural disenfranchisement. The Czechs is an example. Franz Joseph, the Habsburg Empire. He agreed to the new federal structure, and there was a dual monarchy between Austria and Hungary. They were going to rule together with a common system of taxation and common army and a joint foreign policy. But you've got two rulers. So internal and constitutional affairs were separated. The Auschwitz settlement allowed Hungarians their own constitution and capital, and a special status of Hungarians worsened relations with the other groups. You betcha they did. Cultural and intellectual achievements of the polyglot empire. I love that, polyglot empire. It was not going to work. Trying to balance the different nationalities is going to grow increasingly difficult. But both countries were nation building. Territorial and economic expansion, incorporation of new peoples, the contending with the problems of serfdom. In Russia, the abolition of serfdom was only part of a project to rebuild Russia to a modern state. Slavophiles, there's the people who wanted to preserve Russia's distinctive features and idealize traditional Russian culture and the peasant commune. They rejected Western secularism and commercialism and Burgonois culture. They've never liked the West. And I don't mean by the West, the United States. They just never liked the Western part, but they did want to marry into their nobility. Russia should adopt European science, technology, and education. This is what the people who wanted to westernize Russia began to believe. They wanted liberalism and individual rights. But the nobility opposed emancipation. The Crimean War broke out. The impasse, Alexander enforced the issue, and the Emancipation Decree of 1861 was massive. It granted legal rights to 22 million serfs. It gave former serfs title to a portion of the land they'd been living on, and it required the state to compensate the landowners they took the land away from. But paradoxically, the decree produced very little change. The landowners inflated composition claims and kept the best acreage for themselves. And the newly liberated serfs had to pay installments for the land that they were supposed to have been given. So the law granted to the peasants commune, not individual serfs. So Russia pressed east and south. She invaded and conquered the independent Islamic kingdoms along the Silk Road. And she forced Chinese concessions and founded the Siberian city of, oh, good gracious, Vladivostok, I can't say it, in 1860. She began to compete with Britain over Afghanistan, and then Russia annexed Tashkent. In most cases, I would say in probably in all the cases, Russia did not assimilate the population of the new territories. So she becomes a vast geographic empire, but not one nation. what's it called after Lenin? The Union of Socialist Republics. In other words, you've got a whole bunch of little countries speaking different languages, but usually with the same political background. I think that is it. Yep, that's going to be the end of that chapter. I'm sorry for all the mispronunciations, but I have trouble with those words.